Constant capital, the means of production, considered from the standpoint of the creation of surplus value, only exists to absorb labor, and with every drop of labor a proportional quantity of surplus labor. While they fail to do this, their mere existence causes a relative loss to the capitalist, for they represent during the time they lie fallow a useless advance of capital. And this loss becomes positive and absolute as soon as the intermission of their employment necessitates additional outlay at the recommencement of work. The prolongation of the working day beyond the limits of the natural day into the night only acts as a palliative. It quenches only in a slight degree the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor. To appropriate labor during all the hours of the day is, therefore, the inherent tendency of capitalist production. But as it is physically impossible to exploit the same individual labor power constantly during the night as well as the day, to overcome this physical hindrance, an alternation becomes necessary between the workpeople whose powers are exhausted by day and those who are used up by night. This alternation may be effected in various ways. It may be so arranged that part of the workers are 1 week employed on day work, the next week on night work. It is well known that this relay system, this alternation of two sets of workers, held full sway in the full-blooded youth time of the English cotton manufacture, and that at the present time it still flourishes, among others, in the cotton spinning of the Moscow district. This hours process of production exists today as a system in many of the branches of industry of Great Britain that are still free. In the blast furnaces, forges, plate rolling mills, and other metallurgical establishments in England, Wales, and Scotland. The working time here includes, besides the hours of the working days, a great part also of the hours of Sunday. The workers consist of men and women, adults and children of both sexes. The ages of the children and young persons run through all intermediate grades, from 2. In some branches of industry, the girls and women work through the night together with the male. Placing on one side the generally injurious influence of night labor, the duration of the process of production, unbroken during the hours, offers very welcome opportunities of exceeding the limits of the normal working day. In the branches of industry already mentioned, which are of an exceedingly fatiguing nature, the official working day means for each worker usually hours by night or day. But the overwork beyond this amount is in many cases, to use the words of the English official report, truly fearful. It is impossible, the report continues, for any mind to realize the amount of work described in the following passages as being performed by boys of from 2 years of age, without coming irresistibly to the conclusion that such abuses of the power of parents and of employers can no longer be allowed to exist. The practice of boys working at all by day and night turns either in the usual course of things, or at pressing times, seems inevitably to open the door to their not unfrequently working unduly long hours. These hours are, indeed, in some cases, not only cruelly but even incredibly long for children. Amongst a number of boys it will, of course, not unfrequently happen that one or more are from some cause absent. When this happens, their place is made up by one or more boys, who work in the other turn. That this is a well-understood system is plain, from the answer of the manager of some large rolling mills, who, when I asked him how the place of the boys absent from their turn was made up, "I dare say, sir, you know that as well as I do," and admitted the fact. Let us now hear how Kapital itself regards this hours system. The extreme forms of the system, its abuse and the cruel and incredible extension of the working day are naturally passed over in silence. Kapital only speaks of the system in its normal form. Messrs. Naylor and Vickers, steel manufacturers who employ between and persons, among whom only per cent are under, and of those, only boys under work in night sets, thus express themselves. The boys do not suffer from the heat. The temperature is probably from degrees to degrees. At the forges and in the rolling mills the hands work night and day in relays, but all the other parts of the work are day work. From 2 in the forge the hours are from 2. Some of the hands always work in the night, without any alternation of day and night work. We do not find any difference in the health of those who work regularly by night and those who work by day, and probably people can sleep better if they have the same period of rest than if it is changed. About of the boys under the age of work in the night sets, we could not well do without lads under working by night. The objection would be the increase in the cost of production. Skilled hands and the heads in every department are difficult to get, but of lads we could get any number. But from the small proportion of boys that we employ, the subject is of little importance or interest to us. Mr. J. Ellis, one of the firm of Messrs. John Brown and Co., steel and iron works employing about men and boys, part of whose operations, namely iron and heavier steel work, goes on night and day by relays, states that in the heavier steel work 1 or 2 boys are employed to a score or 2 men. Their concern employs upwards of boys under, of whom about divided by or are under the age of. With reference to the proposed alteration of the law, Mr. Ellis says, I do not think it would be very objectionable to require that no person under the age of should work more than hours in them. We do not think that any line could be drawn over the age of, at which boys could be dispensed with for night work. But we would sooner be prevented from employing boys under the age of, or even so high as at all, than not be allowed to employ boys that we do have at night. Those boys who work in the day sets must take their turn in the night sets also, because the men could not work in the night sets only, it would ruin their health. We think, however, that night work in alternate weeks is no harm. We find the men who do it, as well as the others who do other work only by day. Our objections to not allowing boys under to work at night would be on account of the increase of expense, but this is the only reason. The Cyclops steel and iron works of Messrs. Camel and Co. are concocted on the same large scale as those of the above-mentioned John Brown and Co. The managing director had handed in his evidence to the government commissioner, Mr. White, in writing. Later he found it convenient to suppress the MS, when it had been returned to him for revision. Mr. White, however, has a good memory. He remembered quite clearly that for the Messrs. Cyclops the forbidding of the night labor of children and young persons would be impossible, it would be tantamount to stopping their works, and yet their business employs little more than % of boys under, and less than % under. On the same subject Mr. E. F. Sanderson, of the firm of Sanderson, Bros. & Co., Steel Rolling Mills and Forges, a Turcliffe, says, great difficulty would be caused by preventing boys under from working at night. The chief would be the increase of cost from employing men instead of boys. I cannot say what this would be, but probably it would not be enough to enable the manufacturers to raise the price of steel, and consequently it would fall on them, as of course the men would refuse to pay it. Mr. Sanderson does not know how much he pays the children, but perhaps the younger boys get from 2 a week. The boys' work is of a kind for which the strength of the boys is generally quite sufficient, and consequently there would be no gain in the greater strength of the men to counterbalance the loss, or it would be only in the few cases in which the metal is heavy. The men would not like so well not to have boys under them, as men would be less obedient. Besides, boys must begin young to learn the trade. Leaving day work alone open to boys would not answer this purpose. And why not? Why could not boys learn their handicraft in the daytime? Your reason. Owing to the men working days and nights in alternate weeks, the men would be separated half the time from their boys, and would lose half the profit which they make from them. The training which they give to an apprentice is considered as part of the return for the boy's labor, and thus enables the man to get it at a cheaper rate. Each man would want half of this profit. But then there would be the loss from so much expensive machinery, lying idle half the time, and to get through the amount of work which we are able to do on the present system, we should have to double our premises and plant, which would double the outlay. But why should these Sandersons pretend to a privilege not enjoyed by the other capitalists who only work during the day, and whose buildings, machinery, raw material, therefore lie idle during the night? E. F. Sanderson answers in the name of all the Sandersons. It is true that there is this loss from machinery lying idle in those manufactories in which work only goes on by day. But the use of furnaces would involve a further loss in our case. If they were kept up there would be a waste of fuel, and if they were not, there would be loss of time in laying the fires and getting the heat up, and the furnaces themselves would suffer from the changes of temperature. What is a working day? What is the length of time during which capital may consume the labor power whose daily value it buys? How far may the working day be extended beyond the working time necessary for the reproduction of labor power itself? It has been seen that to these questions capital replies. The working day contains the full hours, with the deduction of the few hours of repose without which labor power absolutely refuses its services again. Hence it is self-evident that the laborer is nothing else, his whole life through, than labor power, that therefore all his disposable time is by nature and law labor time, to be devoted to the self-expansion of capital. Time for education, for intellectual development, for the fulfilling of social functions and for social intercourse, for the free play of his bodily and mental activity, even the rest time of Sunday, moonshine. But in its blind, unrestrainable passion, its werewolf hunger for surplus labor, capital oversteps not only the moral, but even the merely physical maximum bounds of the working day. It usurps the time for growth, development, and healthy maintenance of the body. It steals the time required for the consumption of fresh air and sunlight. It higgles over a meal time, incorporating it where possible with the process of production itself, so that food is given to the laborer as to a mere means of production, as coal is supplied to the boiler, grease and oil to the machinery. It reduces the sound sleep needed for the reparation, refreshment of the bodily powers to just so many hours of torpor as the revival of an organism, absolutely exhausted, renders essential. It is not the normal maintenance of the labor power which is to determine the limits of the working day. It is the greatest possible daily expenditure of labor power, no matter how diseased, compulsory, and painful it may be, which is to determine the limits of the laborer's period of repose. Capital cares nothing for the length of life of labor power. All that concerns it is simply and solely the maximum of labor power that can be rendered fluent in a working day. It attains this end by shortening the extent of the laborer's life, as a greedy farmer snatches increased produce from the soil by robbing it of its fertility. The capitalistic mode of production produces thus, with the extension of the working day, not only the deterioration of human labor power by robbing it of its normal, moral, and physical conditions of development and function. It produces also the premature exhaustion and death of this labor power itself. It extends the laborer's time of production during a given period by shortening his actual lifetime. But the value of the labor power includes the value of the commodities necessary for the reproduction of the worker, or for the keeping up of the working class. Then the unnatural extension of the working day, that capital necessarily strives after in its unmeasured passion for self-expansion, shortens the length of life of the individual laborer, and therefore the duration of his labor power. The forces used up have to be replaced at a more rapid rate, and the sum of the expenses for the reproduction of labor power will be greater. Just as in a machine the part of its value to be reproduced every day is greater the more rapidly the machine is worn out. It would seem, therefore, that the interest of capital itself points in the direction of a normal working day. The slave owner buys his laborer as he buys his horse. If he loses his slave, he loses capital that can only be restored by new outlay in the slave market. But the rice grounds of Georgia or the swamps of the Mississippi may be fatally injurious to the human constitution, but the waste of human life which the cultivation of these districts necessitates is not so great that it cannot be repaired from the teeming preserves of Virginia and Kentucky. Considerations of economy, moreover, which, under a natural system, afford some security for humane treatment by identifying the master's interest with the slave's preservation, when once trading in slaves is practiced, become reasons for racking to the uttermost the toil of the slave. For, when his place can at once be supplied from foreign preserves, the duration of his life becomes a matter of less moment than its productiveness while it lasts. It is accordingly a maxim of slave management, in slave-importing countries, that the most effective economy is that which takes out of the human chattel in the shortest space of time the utmost amount of exertion it is capable of putting forth. It is in tropical culture, where annual profits often equal the whole capital of plantations, that Negro life is most recklessly sacrificed. It is the agriculture of the West Indies, which has been for centuries prolific of fabulous wealth, that has engulfed millions of the African race. It is in Cuba at this day, whose revenues are reckoned by millions, and whose planters are princes, that we see in the servile class the coarsest fare, the most exhausting and unremitting toil, and even the absolute destruction of a portion of its numbers every year. Mutato nomen de ti fabula narrator. For slave trade read labor market for Kentucky and Virginia, Ireland and the agricultural districts of England, Scotland, and Wales, for Africa, Germany. We heard how overwork thinned the ranks of the bakers in London. Nevertheless, the London labor market is always overstocked with German and other candidates for death in the bakery. Pottery, as we saw, is one of the shortest-lived industries. Is there any want, therefore, of potters? Josiah Wedgwood, the inventor of modern pottery, himself originally a common workman, said in before the House of Commons that the whole trade employed from 2 people. In the year the population alone of the town centers of this industry in Great Britain number. The cotton trade has existed for 90 years. It has existed for 3 generations of the English race, and I believe I may safely say that during that period it has destroyed 9 generations of factory operatives. No doubt in certain epochs of feverish activity, the labor market shows significant gaps. But then the manufacturers proposed to the poor law commissioners that they should send the surplus population of the agricultural districts to the north, with the explanation that the manufacturers would absorb and use it up. The Barry Guardian said, on the completion of the French treaty, that additional hands could be absorbed by Lancashire, and that ore will be needed. After the flesh agents and subagents had in vain sought through the agricultural districts, a deputation came up to London and waited on the right Hun. Gentlemen, with a view of obtaining poor children from certain union houses for the mills of Lancashire. What experience shows to the capitalist generally is a constant excess of population, an excess in relation to the momentary requirements of surplus labor-absorbing capital, although this excess is made up of generations of human beings stunted, short-lived, swiftly replacing each other, plucked, so to say, before maturity. And indeed, experience shows to the intelligent observer with what swiftness and grip the capitalist mode of production, dating, historically speaking, only from yesterday, has seized the vital power of the people by the very root, shows how the degeneration of the industrial population is only retarded by the constant absorption of primitive and physically uncorrupted elements from the country, shows how even the country laborers, in spite of fresh air and the principle of natural selection, that works so powerfully amongst them, and only permits the survival of the strongest, are already beginning to die off. Capital that has such good reasons for denying the sufferings of the legions of workers that surround it, is in practice moved as much and as little by the sight of the coming degradation and final depopulation of the human race, as by the probable fall of the earth into the sun. In every stock-jobbing swindle everyone knows that some time or other the crash must come, but everyone hopes that it may fall on the head of his neighbor, after he himself has caught the shower of gold and placed it in safety. Après-moi le déluge is the watchword of every capitalist and of every capitalist nation. Hence capital is reckless of the health or length of life of the laborer, unless under compulsion from society. The outcry as to the physical and mental degradation, the premature death, the torture of overwork, it answers, ought these to trouble us since they increase our profits. But looking at things as a whole, all this does not, indeed, depend on the good or ill will of the individual capitalist. Free competition brings out the inherent laws of capitalist production, in the shape of external coercive laws having power over every individual capitalist. The establishment of a normal working day is the result of centuries of struggle between capitalist and laborer. The history of this struggle shows two opposed tendencies. Compare the English factory legislation of our time with the English labor statutes from the 8th century to well into the middle of the whilst the modern factory acts compulsorily shortened the working day. The earlier statutes tried to lengthen it by compulsion. Of course, the pretensions of capital in embryo, when, beginning to grow, it secures the right of absorbing a quantum sufficit of surplus labor, not merely by the force of economic relations, but by the help of the state, appear very modest when put face to face with the concessions that, growling and struggling, it has to make in its adult condition. It takes centuries ere the free laborer, thanks to the development of capitalistic production, is compelled by social conditions, to sell the whole of his active life. His very capacity for work, for the price of the necessaries of life, his birthright for a mess of pottage. Hence it is natural that the lengthening of the working day, which capital, from the middle of the H to the end of the 8th century, tries to impose by state measures on adult laborers, approximately coincides with the shortening of the working day which, in the second half of the 8th century, has here and there been effected by the state to prevent the coining of children's blood into capital. That which today, in the state of Massachusetts, until recently the freest state of the North American Republic, has been proclaimed as the statutory limit of the labor of children under, was in England, even in the middle of the 8th century, the normal working day of able-bodied artisans, robust laborers, athletic blacksmiths. Was not Dr. Andrew Ure right in crying down the hour's bill of as a retrogression to the times of the Dark Ages? It is true these regulations contained in the statute mentioned by Petty apply also to apprentices. But the condition of child labor, even at the end of the 8th century, is seen from the following complaint. 'Tis not their practice as with us in this kingdom, to bind an apprentice for 7 years, 3 or 4 is their common standard, and the reason is because they are educated from their cradle to something of employment, which renders them the more apt and docile, and consequently the more capable of attaining to a ripeness and quicker proficiency in business. Whereas our youth, here in England being bred to nothing before they come to be apprentices, make a very slow progress and require much longer time wherein to reach the perfection of accomplished artists. Still, during the greater part of the 8th century, up to the epoch of modern industry and machinism, capital in England had not succeeded in seizing for itself, by the payment of the weekly value of labor power, the whole week of the laborer, with the exception, however, of the agricultural laborers. The fact that they could live for a whole week on the wage of 4 days did not appear to the laborers a sufficient reason that they should work the other 2 days for the capitalist. One party of English economists, in the interest of capital, denounces this obstinacy in the most violent manner. Another party defends the laborer. Let us listen to the contest between Postlethwaite, whose Dictionary of Trade, then, had the same reputation as the kindred works of MacCulloch and MacGregor today, and the author of the Essay on Trade and Commerce. Postlethwaite says, among other things, "We cannot put an end to those few observations, without noticing that trite remark in the mouth of too many, that if the industrious poor can obtain enough to maintain themselves in 5 days, they will not work the whole 6. Whence they infer the necessity of even the necessaries of life being made dear by taxes, or any other means, to compel the working artisan and manufacturer to labor the whole 6 days in the week, without ceasing. I must beg leave to differ in sentiment from those great politicians, who contend for the perpetual slavery of the working people of this kingdom. They forget the vulgar adage, all work and no play. Have not the English boasted of the ingenuity and dexterity of her working artists and manufacturers, which have heretofore given credit and reputation to British wares in general? What has this been owing to? To nothing more probably than the relaxation of the working people in their own way. Were they obliged to toil the year round, the whole 6 days in the week, in a repetition of the same work, might it not blunt their ingenuity, and render them stupid instead of alert and dexterous? And might not our workmen lose their reputation instead of maintaining it by such eternal slavery? And what sort of workmanship could we expect from such hard-driven animals? Many of them will execute as much work in 4 days as a Frenchman will in 5 or 6. But if Englishmen are to be eternal drudges, 'tis to be feared they will degenerate below the Frenchmen. As our people are famed for bravery in war, do we not say that it is owing to good English roast beef and pudding in their bellies, as well as their constitutional spirit of liberty? And why may not the superior ingenuity and dexterity of our artists and manufacturers be owing to that freedom and liberty to direct themselves in their own way? And I hope we shall never have them deprived of such privileges, and that good living from whence their ingenuity no less than their courage may proceed. Thereupon the author of the Essay on Trade and Commerce replies, if the making of every 7th day and holiday is supposed to be of divine institution, as it implies the appropriating the other 6 days to labor, surely it will not be thought cruel to enforce it. That mankind in general are naturally inclined to ease and indolence, we fatally experience to be true from the conduct of our manufacturing populace, who do not labor, upon an average, above 4 days in a week, unless provisions happen to be very dear. Put all the necessaries of the poor under one denomination. For instance, call them all wheat, or suppose that the bushel of wheat shall cost 5 shillings, and that he earns a shilling by his labor. He then would be obliged to work 5 days only in a week. If the bushel of wheat should cost but 4 shillings, he would be obliged to work but 4 days. But as wages in this kingdom are much higher in proportion to the price of necessaries, the manufacturer, who labors 4 days, has a surplus of money to live idle with the rest of the week. I hope I have said enough to make it appear that the moderate labor of 6 days in a week is no slavery. Our laboring people do this, and to all appearance are the happiest of all our laboring poor, but the Dutch do this in manufactures and appear to be a very happy people. The French do so when holidays do not intervene. But our populace have adopted a notion that as Englishmen they enjoy a birthright privilege of being more free and independent than in any country in Europe. Now this idea, as far as it may affect the bravery of our troops, may be of some use, but the less the manufacturing poor have of it, certainly the better for themselves and for the state. The laboring people should never think themselves independent of their superiors. It is extremely dangerous to encourage mobs in a commercial state like ours, where, perhaps, 7 parts out of 8 of the whole are people with little or no property. The cure will not be perfect till our manufacturing poor are contented to labor 6 days for the same sum which they now earn in 4 days. 12 working hours daily in the ideal workhouse, in the of. Years later, when the English Parliament reduced the working day for children of 2, in 4 branches of industry to full hours, the judgment day of English industry had dawned. When Louis Bonaparte sought to secure his position with the bourgeoisie by tampering with the legal working day, the French working people cried out with one voice at Zurich, the work of children over is limited to hours in Argau. The work of children between and was reduced from a half to hours in Austria for children between, and the same reduction was made. Zinse, Macaulay would shout with exultation. House of Terror, for paupers of which the capitalistic soul of only dreamed, was realized a few years later in the shape of a gigantic workhouse for the industrial worker himself. It is called the factory, and the ideal this time fades before the reality.